He moved into the neighborhood for peace. For quiet mornings with the paper and late evenings walking his dog past tidy yards and flickering porch lights. The kind of place where kids ride their bikes until dusk and neighbors wave without asking questions. To the average eye, the suburban development tucked on the outskirts of Arlington, Virginia, seemed like the perfect escape from a career steeped in adrenaline, risk, and shadows. But when Special Agent Grant Mercer closed on his house on Sycamore Lane, he didn't know he was stepping into the most surreal case of his life, one that wouldn't be logged by the Bureau or listed in field reports, but would still threaten everything he'd worked for. The trouble began with a knock. 3 days after moving in, Grant was unpacking a box of books when a sharp rapping came at the front door. He opened it to find 2 men standing stiffly in matching navy polos with embroidered Neighborhood Security Task Force patches stitched on the chest. The patches were crooked. One of the men, short and broad with mirrored sunglasses, held a clipboard. The other stood silently with a hand resting near what looked suspiciously like pepper spray. They weren't police. That much, Grant knew in an instant. "We're conducting an inspection," Clipboard said, tilting his chin toward the front lawn. "You're in violation of Section 14C of the Neighborhood Appearance Guidelines. Improper edging along your sidewalk and unregistered mailbox style." Grant blinked. "I'm sorry. Who are you again?" The man's expression didn't change. "Neighborhood Security. HOA Enforcement. You should have received the guidelines in your welcome packet." Grant hadn't. And he certainly wasn't about to let 2 imposters bully him on his doorstep. "I'm going to have to see some ID," he said, calm and measured, "because this smells like a scam. And I'm not in the habit of handing over personal information to guys playing dress up." They didn't show ID. They left instead, not before muttering that noncompliance would be noted and processed. That night, Grant filed a report with the local police. But the officer on duty seemed uncertain. "We've gotten a couple complaints about those guys," he said, "but they're always vague. We haven't been able to pin down where they're from or if they're legit." Grant didn't like the ambiguity. In the Bureau, ambiguity was a red flag. It meant someone wanted to hide something. The next few weeks unfolded like a fever dream. The bogus enforcer showed up again, this time snapping photos of his backyard from the alley. A bright orange citation appeared taped to his garage for improper garbage bin placement. One morning, he returned from a jog to find a group of neighbors gathered in the cul-de-sac, whispering, casting nervous glances toward his house. At the center of it all stood Karen Wilkins. Karen was the kind of neighbor who smiled without warmth. Her yard was manicured with military precision. She hosted HOA meetings in her living room and walked the block every morning with a clipboard and a scowl. To most, she was the unofficial queen of Sycamore Lane. To Grant, she was something else entirely. He approached her during a neighborhood barbecue, trying for civility. "I'm confused about the so-called HOA police," he said, beer in hand, voice even. "They don't seem legitimate. You wouldn't happen to know anything about them?" Karen gave a thin smile, her tone clipped. "They're a private security firm retained by the HOA. You're new, so I'll excuse your attitude. But if you plan to live here, I suggest you cooperate." There was something in her tone that grated. Not just superiority, but certainty. As if she knew no one would challenge her. As if she'd built something too large to fall. Grant started digging. Through a contact in the local PD, Officer Carlos Alvarez, he began piecing together the puzzle. The Neighborhood Security Task Force wasn't registered with the state. Their badges were homemade, their uniforms bought in bulk. The HOA had no formal record of hiring them, at least, not on any paper filed with municipal authorities. Alvarez was skeptical at first. But after driving past the security patrol one night and seeing them pull a teenager off his bike for riding without reflectors, he agreed to help. Meanwhile, things escalated. Anonymous complaints began flooding the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility. Allegations that Grant was engaging in unneighborly conduct, intimidating residents, even flashing his badge to threaten civilians. Most of the claims were laughably vague, but they triggered an internal inquiry. His supervisor, a blunt and fair woman named Shaw, called him in. "Someone's throwing mud," she said, tapping a file. "If any of it sticks, it could kill your clearance." Grant couldn't believe it. He'd spent 15 years with the Bureau, had worked counterintelligence in Prague, broken up a terrorist cell in Queens, and now his career was on the line because of HOA drama. But Karen wasn't just petty. She was dangerous. And she wasn't working alone. He traced her connection to the security force, back through a shell company registered under a defunct landscaping business. But the deeper concern came when he discovered her uncle, Deputy Director Marshall Keegan, was a high-ranking official in the Bureau. Suddenly, it all made sense. The arrogance. The immunity. Karen had power behind her, and she knew how to use it. Grant couldn't go through Bureau channels. Keegan's reach meant any internal probe could be tainted. So he turned back to Alvarez. Together, they gathered testimonies, quiet interviews with neighbors who had been fined for made-up violations, threatened with eviction, even followed home by the fake enforcers. But few were willing to go public. Karen had built an empire of fear. Still, Grant persisted. He documented every incident, every encounter, every phony ticket. He installed cameras, collected audio, and waited for the right moment. That moment came when Karen called a community meeting at the local rec center. It was billed as an HOA update, but the real agenda was to vote on making the Neighborhood Security Task Force an official branch of the Homeowners Association, complete with funding, authority, and the power to penalize. Grant showed up early. He didn't speak until Karen finished her speech. Until she handed out glossy pamphlets showing smiling officers and claiming reductions in crime. Then he stood, holding a file folder and a portable speaker. A hush fell over the room. Dozens of neighbors sat frozen in metal folding chairs, the buzz of ceiling fans the only sound. Karen stared at him from behind the podium, her expression rigid, as though daring him to continue. He did. "These men you've hired aren't licensed. The company doesn't exist in the state's corporate registry. The badges are fake. The citations they've been handing out are meaningless. They have no legal right to demand access to private property." He flipped open the folder and distributed copies of a printed report, public records, business license searches, photographs of the fake officers in action. Alvarez, seated in the back, gave a quiet nod of support. "You've been scammed," Grant said, raising his voice just enough to carry through the room. "And worse, you've been bullied. Intimidated into silence. People have been fined, harassed, even followed, based on a lie." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A few people leaned forward, whispering to one another. Others looked at Karen, waiting for a response. She stepped from behind the podium with icy composure. "This man is lying," she said sharply. "He's a federal agent who thinks he's above community rules. He's trying to discredit me because he doesn't want to be held accountable." Grant didn't flinch. "I'm accountable to the law, not to some made-up task force you pulled out of thin air." He pressed a button on the portable speaker. The room filled with the sound of a recorded conversation. Karen's voice, unmistakably clear, instructing one of her security goons to apply pressure to a neighbor who refused to mow his lawn. More murmurs. A few gasps. Then silence. By the time the meeting ended, Alvarez had already called in a team from the local precinct. Karen was taken into custody 2 days later, not just for impersonating law enforcement, but also for conspiracy to commit fraud and unlawful surveillance. Her so-called officers scattered like cockroaches, abandoning their posts and peeling the stickers off their SUVs before vanishing. The fallout was swift. Internal Affairs at the Bureau opened a probe into Deputy Director Keegan. Under pressure, and with damning evidence linking him to funding the shell company Karen used, he resigned quietly before facing formal charges. The scandal made the rounds in DC circles, though it was mostly buried beneath bureaucratic platitudes. Still, it was enough to clear Grant's name. It didn't happen overnight. The OPR cleared him of all wrongdoing, but his reputation had taken a hit. He had to rebuild trust with colleagues, had to explain himself in closed-door interviews and clearance reviews. But the truth held up under scrutiny. In the end, he was vindicated. Sycamore Lane changed too. Slowly, tentatively, neighbors began to speak more freely. The fear Karen had cultivated gave way to cautious optimism. The HOA underwent an overhaul. Rules were rewritten, elections held. The neighborhood, once quiet in an oppressive sort of way, became genuinely peaceful. Grant stayed. He fixed the edging along the sidewalk, not because a fake citation had demanded it, but because he wanted to. He planted roses along the fence, joined the occasional neighborhood watch meeting, and even hosted a 4th of July cookout, grilling hot dogs for kids who used to dart past his house nervously. But he never forgot. The incident became more than a strange chapter in his career. It was a remin. Grant began receiving emails from people in other suburbs, even other states, who'd read a local news piece that leaked details of the investigation. The article had been small, buried between budget updates and obituaries, but the story caught the attention of community activists and HOA reform groups. One message stood out. It was from a woman in Florida, claiming her HOA president had threatened to evict residents for parking infractions and had begun deputizing neighborhood monitors in a disturbingly similar fashion. Her message ended with, "How do you stand up to someone who has all the power and none of the conscience?" Grant responded, carefully, cautiously, but the message haunted him. He realized Karen's scam hadn't been an anomaly. It had been a template, one that could be replicated in any place where people were too afraid or too tired to fight back. He decided to start documenting what happened. Not for revenge, and not even for a formal case file, but as a way to set the record straight. Late at night, in a quiet corner of his study, he began writing. He detailed the first knock on the door, the fake citations, the looks of fear in his neighbor's eyes. He wrote about the community meeting, the moment of confrontation, the unraveling of Karen's empire. He wrote about Officer Alvarez, about the courage it took for neighbors to speak up, and about the quiet strength required to resist corruption that hides in plain sight. The writing helped. It made the experience feel less surreal, more digestible. But it also rekindled something in him, an instinct that hadn't dulled since his days on international assignments. Suspicion. Karen's trial was looming. And though she was out on bail, her silence didn't sit well with Grant. He'd expected a media defense, a smear campaign, some kind of retaliation. But there had been nothing. And when he checked the local docket to follow up on the pretrial motions, he found something odd. Her legal team had filed nearly 20 requests for delay. Continuances, challenges to evidence, procedural motions, all tactics to stall the inevitable. And they were working. He brought the matter up with Alvarez one morning at their usual diner. "Think she's playing for time?" Grant asked, stirring his coffee. Alvarez shrugged. "She's got money. And friends in strange places. It's not impossible she's hoping the trail goes cold." Grant leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Or she's setting up something else. You think she's not done?" Grant didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a worn envelope from his jacket. Inside were 5 letters, all anonymously mailed, all postmarked within 2 weeks of each other. The messages were short, accusatory phrases about misusing authority, undermining community leaders, and one that simply read, "You don't belong here." Alvarez looked over the letters and let out a low whistle. "You report these? I scanned them in, logged them with OPR. But they're vague. No direct threats. Nothing actionable. Still," Alvarez said, flipping one over, "this stamp's from DC. She might have helped outside our backyard." Grant nodded grimly. "She had friends before. Why not now?" Over the following weeks, Grant increased his caution. He updated the cameras on his property. He changed his routes during daily walks. He even began carrying a small recorder during neighborhood events, something he hadn't done since his early field assignments. His paranoia wasn't without cause. One evening, while pulling into his driveway, he spotted a dark SUV idling at the far end of the cul-de-sac. It didn't move when he approached, but the moment he entered his home, it rolled slowly down the block and disappeared. He checked footage from his doorbell cam, sent it to Alvarez, and began watching for patterns. 2 nights later, his motion sensor light triggered at 3:14 a.m. The camera caught the shadow of someone at the fence, too blurred to identify, but clearly watching. Grant didn't sleep well after that. Then, something stranger happened. A new couple moved into the neighborhood, quiet, mid-30s, claimed they were from Utah. But their questions during casual conversation struck him as off. Too pointed. Too interested in his past assignments, his current schedule, the status of Karen's trial. Grant quietly passed their names to a friend at the Bureau's domestic surveillance team. A week later, the response came. No record of any employment, no verified addresses in Utah, no tax filings for the last 5 years. Ghost thought that's when he knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't trying to reclaim power through legal means. She was trying to erase the story. To make people forget. To shake the only witness who still had the full picture. But Grant wasn't going to forget. Not this time. The realization that the game hadn't ended with Karen's arrest struck Grant harder than he expected. For months, he'd allowed himself the luxury of recovery, of believing the worst had passed, that accountability had prevailed, and that his part in the drama was finished. But now, standing in his own kitchen with security footage paused mid-frame on a stranger's silhouette, he understood that the struggle wasn't just about Karen. It was about the system that had enabled her. And it was far from done with him. He met with Alvarez again, this time in a parking garage beneath the courthouse, an old bureau habit he hadn't used in years. The off-the-record nature of the meeting gave their conversation weight. Two people with no digital footprint move into your neighborhood within days of each other. That's not coincidence, Alvarez said. This is organized. Grant nodded. Which means Karen still has access to someone with clearance. Someone helping scrub records. What's the play? Witness intimidation. More like suppression. She knows she can't clear her name, so she's trying to taint mine before the full trial starts. Alvarez cursed under his breath. What do you need from me? Cover. And access. I need to know who she's been in contact with. Visitors. Phone records. Email aliases. I don't care how thin, if there's a trail, I'll follow it. It wasn't protocol. But it was necessary. In the weeks that followed, Grant worked two fronts. By day, he resumed a standard caseload at the Bureau, careful to stay visible, steady, and seemingly unbothered. By night, he pored over court documents, contractor lists, subpoena correspondence, and prison visitation logs. What he found disturbed him. Karen had maintained encrypted email correspondence with at least 3 former Bureau employees, one of whom had been quietly dismissed for ethics violations 3 years earlier. Another had moved into private security. The third, Grant's heart sank, was someone he knew personally, Eric Langston, a former field coordinator turned liaison. They'd worked together in D.C. on several projects, and Langston had always struck him as sharp but power-hungry, someone who believed the rules didn't always apply to insiders. Grant set up a meeting under the pretense of catching up. They met at a coffee shop in Crystal City, the kind of anonymous, neutral space where nothing looked out of place. Langston arrived smiling, casual, unsuspecting. Grant kept it friendly for exactly 2 minutes before leaning in. Karen Wilkins, he said. You've been talking to her. Langston's smile faltered. Excuse me? You heard me. I've seen the logs. The IP traces. Don't insult me. Langston's expression hardened. You're on dangerous ground, Mercer. No, Eric. You are? You're the one helping a federal suspect manipulate witnesses. That's obstruction. Minimum 5 years. And I have half a mind to make sure you serve every day of it. Langston glanced around. I didn't break any laws. She reached out. Said she had evidence. Said she was being framed. You believe that? I believe she wasn't the only one with something to lose. That line sat heavy between them. What does that mean? Langston leaned in. You really think Karen was the mastermind? You think someone with her background could orchestrate a neighborhood power scheme, cover it with shell companies, fake credentials, and get away with it for as long as she did, without help? Grant narrowed his eyes. Are you saying there's more? Langston hesitated. I'm saying Karen was a tool. She liked control, but someone gave her the blueprint. Someone who wanted to test a model. And if it worked on a neighborhood, maybe they'd scale it up. Grant sat back stunned. The thought hadn't occurred to him, not really. But now that it had, it made awful sense. If someone could create a compliance force in a suburban cul-de-sac, weaponize fear, enforce fake rules, and get neighbors to turn on each other, what was stopping them from trying it somewhere bigger? A town. A county. A city block in a contentious district. Who? Grant asked. Langston didn't answer. He just gave a slight shrug, like a man who knew he'd said too much and was prepared to let the silence protect him. That night, Grant didn't sleep. He stared at his ceiling for hours, reviewing everything again. Karen's methodical control over the HOA, the fear, the impersonation, the bureaucratic camouflage. It hadn't been about her ego. It had been a proof of concept. The next morning he called Shaw. I need to reopen the investigation, he said, skipping all pleasantries. There was a pause. On what grounds? Expansion. The fraud was bigger than we thought. Karen wasn't acting alone. And I've got names, digital trails, and motive. Come to Quantico. The meeting that followed was unlike any Grant had experienced in his career. It involved a classified room, a digital forensics team, and 3 senior agents from counterintelligence. As he laid out his findings, Langston's involvement, the ghost tenants, the reemergence of familiar IP addresses and other HOA enforcement schemes, he watched their expressions shift from polite interest to quiet alarm. By the end of the presentation, Shaw nodded once. We'll task a team. But you stay on it. Grant raised an eyebrow. I thought you wanted me off this mess. I did, she said. But it's not a mess anymore. It's a blueprint. And you're the only one who's seen the whole thing. He was back in, but this time, it wasn't just about protecting a neighborhood. It was about understanding the scope of an idea that someone, somewhere, thought could be weaponized. A private army disguised as civic order. A psychological operation masquerading as local governance. And the scariest part? It had almost worked. Back home, Sycamore Lane seemed peaceful again. The kids played basketball in driveways. The mail arrived on time. The lights flickered on at dusk like clockwork. But Grant knew that peace was a facade. A delicate illusion resting on the backs of a few brave people who had dared to say, no. He no longer believed in retirement. Not really. The world didn't let you walk away when you'd seen the blueprint. It just waited for you to get tired enough to stop looking. And Grant Mercer wasn't tired. He was just getting started. The official reinvestigation moved quietly but swiftly. Within a month, a multi-agency task force was established, operating under the radar of public scrutiny. It was dubbed Operation Street Watch, an ironically benign name for a program targeting the abuse of localized power under the guise of public safety. Grant wasn't given an official command role. He didn't want one, but he became its unofficial conscience, the man in the room who remembered that the enemy didn't wear uniforms or carry weapons. They wore trust like a cloak, wielding fear like a scalpel. As Operation Street Watch traced similar neighborhood enforcement initiatives around the country, some already active, others in planning phases. Grant was struck by how systemic it had become. In Houston, an HOA president had enlisted a private firm to install security gates and employ unlicensed guards. In a Seattle suburb, drones were used under the guise of noise patrol, secretly recording residents. In Florida, a community council authorized fines for unapproved speech on community message boards. Each situation operated under a thin veneer of legitimacy. Each had ties to the same web of funding, shell companies, political donors, and, chillingly, a consultancy firm registered under the name Archway Civil Systems. Archway, a company Grant had never heard of before. But when he pulled their incorporation documents, something clicked. IT had been created 5 years earlier, 3 weeks after Karen Wilkins had filed her first HOA leadership papers. The timeline was too perfect. Digging deeper, Grant found Archway's original signatory, a man named Nolan Greaves, a former DHS analyst with a history of controversial community surveillance experiments. Publicly, Greaves had retired. Privately, he'd become a consultant for neighborhood resiliency frameworks, a euphemism for civilian control models. Grant brought the file to Shaw again. This guy didn't just advise Karen. He trained her, funded her. She was his beta test. Shaw studied the dossier. What's he doing now? Nothing obvious. But Archway's tech licenses are still active. They're building something. I want to see it. She gave the green light. 2 weeks later, Grant flew to Denver under a different name. That's where Archway's shell headquarters sat, a single suite inside a nondescript business park near Aurora. The receptionist was a lease service. No employees. No open doors. But through an intercepted vendor contract, Grant found their off-site development center, a rural property 45 minutes north, outfitted with sensors, network servers, and cameras that monitored entrance roads. What they were building wasn't just theory. It was infrastructure. He didn't go in himself. He said local bureau surveillance teams instead. What they found rattled even the hardened analysts. IT was a simulation, not just a software program, but a physical model, a mock neighborhood, complete with fake houses, resident actors, surveillance nodes, and predictive behavior algorithms. Grant watched hours of footage showing how the system would flag a non-compliant resident based on behavioral changes, fewer social interactions, irregular trash placement, uncut lawns. Then, the program would activate enforcement, a series of escalating contacts meant to isolate, pressure, and punish. IT was Sycamore Lane in software. A digital autocracy disguised as neighborhood security. When Grant returned to Virginia, he knew the game had changed. What started as one woman's twisted experiment was now a privatized formula for control, marketed, funded, and spreading. He visited Alvarez that night, carrying a bottle of whiskey and a flash drive. I was wrong, he said quietly, as they sat on the back porch. Karen wasn't the threat. She was the warning. Alvarez listened as Grant walked him through Archway's simulation, how it would use smart devices, community platforms, and surveillance data to create compliance scores for every resident in a neighborhood. It's social credit. Localized. Subtle. No one notices until it's too late. Is it legal? Not yet. But they're lobbying. They're positioning it as crime prevention, community optimization. All the buzzwords. Alvarez leaned back. So what do we do? Grant was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, we show people. We make noise. We expose it before they can scale it. We use every contact, every platform, every policy hawk who still remembers what freedom looks like. And that's what he did. He took leaves from the bureau, went on podcasts, wrote articles under a pseudonym, spoke at legal conferences and technology ethics panels. Slowly, a movement formed, not a political one, but a civic one. HOA reformers, cybersecurity experts, privacy watchdogs, and residents who'd been targeted by similar schemes began speaking up. Grant didn't need to be the face. He just wanted to be the spark. As the public scrutiny intensified, Archway Civil Systems folded within a year. Greaves vanished, his properties liquidated. The simulation hub was seized under the guise of zoning violations, but its servers had already been cloned by federal investigators. Karen was finally convicted, not just of impersonation and fraud, but of conspiracy. She was sentenced to 7 years. Her appeal failed, and Sycamore Lane, it became a quiet legend. A case study in both corruption and resilience. A place where things went very wrong, until one man decided enough was enough. Grant stayed. He bought the empty lot behind his house, and turned it into a community garden. Kids came to help. Neighbors laughed again. And while he still kept the cameras up, he didn't check the footage every day, because peace, in the end, wasn't about the absence of threats. It was about knowing that when the next one came, someone would be ready to stand up.